"Shut that kid up." The words cut through the luxurious dining room like a knife, as all eyes turned toward the table at the center of the room. Ethan, the 6-year-old son of billionaire CEO William Ross, was screaming uncontrollably, his voice piercing the otherwise quiet atmosphere. The fine crystal glasses on the table shook with each screech, and the soft murmurs of high-powered executives and tech moguls came to an abrupt halt. William sat at the head of the table, his face twisted with frustration, his hand gripping his glass so tightly it might shatter. But it wasn't just the noise that annoyed him. It was the public spectacle, the discomfort his son's behavior was causing, and the embarrassment it was bringing. As the room tensed, Rachel Hayes, a 25-year-old black waitress, quietly approached the table, her uniform perfectly pressed, her posture straight. No one noticed her as she slipped between the crowded tables, moving with the grace of someone who had long learned to blend into the background. But this time it was different. This wasn't just another night of waiting on people who barely acknowledged her presence. This was a turning point. As Rachel neared the table, she saw the tension in William's face, the disdain in his eyes as he looked at his son. Ethan's tantrum had become a public embarrassment, and William was losing his cool. Rachel paused for a brief moment, looking down at the young boy. His eyes were wide with distress, his small body trembling with the force of his screams. Despite the chaos, Rachel's calmness stood in stark contrast. She could see what no one else saw, the fear in Ethan's eyes. She didn't need to speak to understand. Rachel bent down slowly, her voice soft and steady. "Hey buddy, it's okay. We can work through this." She didn't try to force words onto him, didn't raise her voice. Instead, she just sat down beside him. The room held its breath as William glanced around the room, not sure whether to be embarrassed or enraged. He had money, power, and status, but none of that seemed to matter in this moment. His son was in distress, and he didn't know how to handle it. The executives at the table shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to intervene. But Rachel, with nothing more than patience and kindness, had already taken charge. She gently placed a hand on Ethan's back, her presence calming the boy. His breathing slowed, his body relaxing as he leaned into her warmth. The screams stopped. A hush fell over the room as Rachel remained calm, her hand still on Ethan's back, comforting him in a way no one else could. William Ross looked on, his face a mixture of disbelief and confusion. His son was no longer screaming, but it wasn't because of any action he had taken. It was because a woman who wasn't part of his world, who had nothing to prove, simply chose to be there when no one else could. The power of the moment was undeniable. Rachel didn't need to command the room. She didn't need to impress anyone. She had already done what no one else could. She had calmed a child, and in doing so she had earned something more valuable than any stock, deal, or contract: respect. The room didn't know it yet, but this was a moment that would change everything. As the room fell into an uneasy silence, Rachel remained seated beside Ethan, her hand still resting gently on his back. The tension in the air was palpable, but Rachel didn't flinch. She simply stayed there, offering nothing more than her calm presence. The child's cries had subsided, replaced by soft breaths as he finally began to settle. William, still at the head of the table, sat frozen in disbelief. The scene before him was one he never expected. He was a man accustomed to control, to having the answers to every situation, but here in front of him was a woman who didn't need to say a word to change everything. As the seconds ticked by, William's irritation began to give way to a strange sense of humility. He watched as Rachel's quiet confidence worked its magic on his son, and for the first time that night, he felt a pang of regret. Ethan, now calmer, looked up at Rachel with wide eyes, his earlier fear replaced by a faint sense of trust. Rachel smiled gently, her voice soft as she asked, "Feeling better now, buddy?" Ethan nodded slowly, still in awe of the kindness that had come without judgment. The whole room was still, like a moment frozen in time, but it wasn't just the silence that held them. It was the realization that something had changed, something profound. The people around the table, the ones who had previously only seen Rachel as the waitress, now saw her in a different light. William, who had built his empire on quick decisions and sharper instincts, was now confronted with a situation that no amount of money or influence could resolve. He had been so focused on the bigger picture, the meetings, the deals, the wealth, that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. Here in this moment it was Rachel, the woman he had dismissed as just a waitress, who was the one showing him the way. William's mind raced, his pride clashing with the reality of what had just happened. The same room that had once looked down on Rachel now seemed to lean in, as if waiting for her next move. But she didn't act with bravado or demand their attention. She simply stood up, gave Ethan one last comforting smile, and began to walk away. Her exit was quiet, but it was enough. Enough to leave William and the others in stunned silence. Outside the restaurant, the crisp night air felt different, as though it carried a weight of something unspoken. Rachel walked through the streets, her steps steady but her thoughts deep in reflection. She had known moments like this all her life, moments where her value was overlooked, where her presence was dismissed, where she was just a face in the crowd. But tonight something had shifted. She had made a difference without even trying. She had shown them all that sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer isn't money, power, or prestige. It's simply the ability to be kind when it's least expected. Rachel knew this wasn't about a job well done or an apology from William. It was about something far greater, the quiet strength that comes from being seen, really seen for who you are, not just what others expect you to be. Inside the restaurant, the conversation had resumed, but there was a noticeable shift in the air. The chatter wasn't the same. The glances weren't the same. Rachel had left an imprint on this room, on these people, and whether they realized it or not, they would never look at her, or anyone like her, the same way again. As Rachel stepped outside, the cool evening air hit her face, but it felt different, lighter somehow. She had expected the usual rush of thoughts, the anxious pull of self-doubt that usually accompanied moments like these. But tonight there was none of that. As she walked down the quiet street, her feet tapping softly against the pavement, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something inside her. It wasn't just the fact that she had calmed down a child who no one else seemed to understand. It was the way the room had reacted. William Ross had been visibly shaken by her presence, his authority crumbling as he witnessed the quiet power she possessed. The man who had once been so dismissive now found himself in awe, and the others too began to see Rachel for who she truly was. As she passed by a small cafe, the warm light spilling from its windows, she paused for a moment, letting herself take in the night. Her life hadn't always been easy. She had been underestimated, overlooked, treated as if she was invisible. Growing up, she was taught that people like her didn't get to take up space, didn't get to demand respect. But now, standing here in the night, she realized something. She didn't have to demand respect. She didn't have to prove herself. It was already there. The way William had looked at her earlier, that was enough. The respect, the acknowledgement, it didn't have to come from titles or wealth or power. It came from within, from the quiet, unshakable confidence of knowing that what she did mattered. Her heart fluttered with something she hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of peace. It wasn't just about the money or the recognition. It was about the lives she touched, even in small ways. Ethan's calming, the look of surprise in William's eyes, the subtle shift in the room's energy. Those were the things that mattered. Rachel knew deep down that the world didn't have to give her anything. She had everything she needed to make a difference. She had always known it, but tonight it had crystallized. As she walked, the streetlights flickering gently in the night, she felt a wave of gratitude. It wasn't for the success she had or the acknowledgement she just received. It was for the reminder that she was enough. That every moment, every action, no matter how small, had its own power. Back at the restaurant, the murmurs of conversation had resumed, but something had shifted. The guests, the executives, the powerful men who had once looked through Rachel as if she were nothing, now looked at her with new eyes. Some were trying to hide their surprise, others couldn't stop stealing glances in her direction. It wasn't her appearance that had changed. It was their perception of her. And William? William Ross sat at the table, still processing everything. He had been the king in his world, used to people listening, obeying, following his lead. But now, in this one moment, he had seen something far more powerful than his wealth or status. He had seen the quiet strength of a woman who knew her worth without needing anyone else to tell her. As Rachel continued down the street, she felt the weight of the evening settle in. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready for it. Ready for whatever came next. No longer just a waitress, no longer just a bystander in her own life. She was the one making the difference. She was the one with the power. The next day, the weight of last night lingered in the air, but Rachel found herself not as affected as she would have expected. It wasn't just the passing glance of acknowledgement from the rich and powerful at the restaurant. It wasn't even the whispered conversations she caught as she walked past tables. No, what had changed was something far deeper. Her life had always been a balancing act, working double shifts, taking care of her son, dealing with the pressures that came with living in a world that often overlooked people like her. But last night something had shifted. She felt different now. As Rachel tied her apron that morning and began her shift at the same high-end restaurant, she didn't feel the same weight of being just another server. The other waitstaff had begun to look at her differently too. There was a new respect in their eyes, something she hadn't expected. Even the manager, who had always treated her as nothing more than a means to an end, gave her a nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was the little things that mattered. As she moved between tables, Rachel noticed the change. The way people looked at her now wasn't the same. There was a softness to their gaze, as if they were seeing her for the first time. Some of the regular customers, who used to call her sweetheart or dear, now spoke to her with genuine curiosity. But it wasn't the change in the customers' behavior that affected Rachel the most. It was William Ross. He had been sitting at the same table for 2 consecutive nights now, this time without his son, but with a few associates. Rachel had noticed him earlier in the evening when he had arrived, but she wasn't focused on him. She wasn't paying attention to the man who had once looked down on her like she was invisible. But now, as she approached his table to take their orders, she couldn't help but notice how his gaze followed her as she moved around the room. His demeanor had softened. He wasn't the same man who had looked at her with nothing but disdain the night before. There was a subtle shift in his attitude, a change in the way he held himself. It wasn't obvious, but Rachel could sense it. The tension in the air between them was gone. When she placed a drink on his table, he looked up at her and smiled. A real smile, not the corporate smile he gave to everyone else. "Thank you, Rachel," he said quietly, his voice low, almost as if he were unsure of the words. It wasn't much, but it meant everything. It wasn't just gratitude for the drink. It was acknowledgement. Rachel paused for a moment, allowing herself to absorb the weight of the words. William Ross, the billionaire CEO who had once dismissed her without a second thought, had just acknowledged her. And it wasn't a passing comment. It was genuine. He didn't need to say anything more, because in that moment, Rachel knew that the game had changed. William had seen her, truly seen her, in a way he never had before. And that was all she needed. She didn't need to be his equal in wealth or status. She didn't need his approval. She had already found her worth. The way she carried herself, the strength she showed last night when the whole room had been watching, it was more than enough. It was everything. As Rachel moved back into the kitchen, her heart was lighter than it had been in years. She didn't need the validation of anyone else. She had already proven something far greater. And as the dinner service continued that evening, she knew that from this moment on, things would never be the same. Days passed, and the rhythm of Rachel's life seemed to settle into a new quiet harmony. The change in the air was subtle, but it was there. Her routine at the restaurant had always been a blur. Bustling through the dining room, taking orders, refilling glasses, and keeping the flow of service moving. But now she noticed a shift in how the other staff members treated her. They were more respectful, more considerate, almost as if they had all silently acknowledged the power of her presence. William Ross continued to show up with his associates, but it wasn't just his acknowledgement that made her feel different. It was the way he looked at her now, like she was not just a waitress but a person with value, someone whose worth went far beyond her job title. She could tell that he too was grappling with something. The brief exchanges between them had become less formal, more human. No longer was he the distant, cold billionaire CEO. He was just a man trying to make sense of his world. Rachel didn't expect anything from him, but there was a mutual understanding now, an unspoken respect. One evening, as she approached his table to refill his water glass, their eyes met. There was no awkwardness, no lingering tension. It was a quiet moment, but it spoke volumes. "Rachel," he said, looking up from his conversation with a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "You handled things well last week. I was impressed." His words hung in the air for a moment, and Rachel simply nodded. It wasn't the praise itself that mattered. It was the recognition of her strength, of her ability to stand firm in a situation where most would have faltered. She didn't need to hear those words from him. She knew what she had done, and more importantly, she knew why she had done it. It was for Ethan, yes, but it was also for herself. She had made a difference that night without asking for anything in return. And that, more than anything, was the true victory. As the days went on, the once constant hustle of the restaurant began to feel less overwhelming. Rachel moved with purpose, her steps confident, grounded in a sense of self-assurance she had never known before. She began to realize that she didn't need the approval of the wealthy patrons around her to feel good about who she was. She had already proven her worth in the most profound way. The conversations around the restaurant shifted, too. Her colleagues no longer whispered behind her back or treated her like an invisible figure moving between tables. There was a new kind of camaraderie, an unspoken bond that had formed between them. It wasn't just because Rachel had calmed Ethan down that night, but because they had all witnessed something powerful, something that transcended wealth and status. They had seen her stand tall when others would have been crushed by the weight of expectation. The work she did, the way she showed up every day, was a testament to her resilience. William's acknowledgement was just the beginning. It was the first crack in the wall of indifference that had separated them. Now when they spoke, it was more than just about business or service. It was about respect, mutual understanding, and shared humanity. Rachel had entered that restaurant as just another worker, another face in the crowd. But she was leaving it as something much more. She was a woman who had made a difference, who had shown others that true power didn't come from money or status, but from the ability to stand strong, to remain kind, and to do what was right, even when no one was watching. The following week, Rachel continued her work at the restaurant, but something felt different. The usual noise of plates clinking, the chatter of well-dressed diners, and the occasional ding of the kitchen bell all felt muted in comparison to the weight she now carried in her chest. She wasn't just going through the motions anymore. There was purpose in her every step. It wasn't the attention of the guests, nor the subtle nods of approval from her colleagues that changed her daily routine. It was the growing sense of self-respect she had cultivated. Even William Ross, who had once looked at her like she was nothing more than a service worker, seemed to view her through a different lens now. He no longer treated her as an invisible part of the scenery, but instead acknowledged her as an equal in small, unspoken ways. Rachel never sought this validation. It wasn't necessary for her to feel seen. She had learned to see herself, to believe in her worth, regardless of anyone else's opinions. But as the days passed, she could tell that something had shifted in the energy of the restaurant. The conversations, the looks from the regulars, there was a quiet reverence that had taken root. And it wasn't just for Rachel. It was for the kind of strength she had shown when she refused to be silenced or pushed aside. It was a lesson that no one could ignore, no matter their status. One evening, as Rachel passed by William's table, he caught her gaze. For a moment their eyes locked, and there was no awkwardness, no tension, just a silent understanding. "Rachel," he began, his voice more sincere than she had ever heard it. "I don't think I've ever properly thanked you." His words were simple, but they carried weight, a sincerity that reached beyond politeness. "You did something I didn't know was possible. You helped my son, and you did it in a way that none of my resources or influence could ever have done." Rachel paused for a moment, her heart skipping a beat. It wasn't the first time she had been thanked, but it was the first time it felt real. She smiled softly, not out of obligation, but because she understood the truth in his words. "He's just a kid," she replied quietly. "But sometimes all they need is someone to see them, someone to just be there." William nodded, his eyes reflecting a hint of vulnerability that was so rare for a man like him. "I don't think I understood what it meant to truly be there until I saw you with him." Rachel didn't respond. She didn't need to. His acknowledgement was enough. He had seen her, not just as a waitress but as a person. And in that moment, she realized that she didn't need anyone's approval. She had already proven everything she needed to prove, not to them but to herself. As Rachel continued with her duties, the evening unfolded in its usual rhythm, but she walked through the space with a newfound sense of calm. She wasn't walking on air, but she wasn't walking in the shadows either. She had stepped into her own light, and no one could take that away from her. It wasn't about making grand gestures or seeking validation anymore. It was about knowing her own worth, standing firm in it, and being true to herself. William's gratitude, his change of heart, it was a recognition that wasn't just about the dinner, or about what she had done for his son. It was about understanding that real power wasn't about money, wasn't about titles. It was about the quiet strength of standing by your principles, no matter how much the world tried to push you down. And Rachel Hayes knew without a doubt that she had found that strength within herself. It had been a few weeks since Rachel had noticed the changes, but the feeling of transformation still lingered in the air. As she moved through her shifts at the restaurant, the once familiar rhythm of her job now felt different. She wasn't just working anymore. She was fully present in each moment, in every interaction. She had found a new kind of power within herself, one that came not from being recognized by others, but from recognizing her own strength. That evening, as the restaurant filled with its usual bustle of wealthy patrons and their conversations about stocks, deals, and the latest social gossip, Rachel felt a sense of quiet pride in what she had accomplished. The customers who used to ignore her, the ones who saw only the uniform and not the person beneath, now looked at her with a kind of respect. She didn't need to command it. It came naturally. People were starting to notice her not just for the job she did, but for the way she carried herself, the way she navigated the world with a quiet confidence. William Ross continued to visit the restaurant regularly, always accompanied by his associates. He no longer sat at the table like a distant figure, cold and unapproachable. He had softened, as if he had learned something that had shifted the way he saw the world. Every now and then, when Rachel would serve his table, their eyes would meet, and there was no longer any barrier between them. No cuernis, no hierarchy. Just two people, sharing a moment of understanding. One night, as Rachel approached his table with a fresh bottle of wine, William looked up at her with a smile that was genuine. "Rachel," he said, his tone warm. "I've been meaning to tell you. You've changed things here." Rachel raised an eyebrow slightly, unsure of what he meant. "What do you mean?" she asked, setting the wine bottle down with practiced grace. "You've brought something here that wasn't here before," he said, his gaze steady. "It's not just about the service or the food. It's about the way you make people see each other. It's the way you've made me see things differently." Rachel nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. She hadn't set out to change the entire dynamic of the restaurant. She hadn't expected to be acknowledged or praised. But somewhere along the way she had made a difference, not by trying but by being herself. She wasn't pretending to be someone she wasn't. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just doing her job with kindness and integrity, and it had resonated with people in ways she hadn't expected. As she walked away from William's table, Rachel felt a surge of gratitude. Not because of his words, but because she knew that everything she had done had come from a place of authenticity. She had stayed true to who she was, even when the world had told her not to. And now she could see that the world was starting to recognize her for it. The respect wasn't about the money or the status, it was about the quiet power of being seen for who you truly were. Rachel moved through the rest of the evening, her steps light, her heart full. She had done what many had told her was impossible. She had created her own space in a world that tried to push her out. And she wasn't going anywhere. Weeks went by, and the steady rhythm of Rachel's life continued, but now with a quiet confidence that had taken root in her soul. The restaurant remained as busy as ever, filled with the hum of voices, the clinking of silverware, and the laughter of those who dined in its opulent surroundings. Yet Rachel noticed something new, something that had begun to shift, not just within her but around her. The other waitstaff seemed to look at her differently now. There was no longer any hint of the dismissive attitudes or casual disregard that she had endured before. Instead, there was an unspoken sense of camaraderie, a recognition of something deeper that had been revealed. Rachel had never asked for this kind of attention, but it was clear that her strength had not gone unnoticed. People were beginning to realize that she wasn't just a waitress. She was someone who commanded respect, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it with every quiet act of kindness and strength. Even the regular patrons, the wealthy businessmen and women who had once ignored her, began to take a second glance when she passed by. It wasn't the kind of attention she had ever sought, but it was the kind that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before. As Rachel moved between the tables, doing her work with the same efficiency and grace she always had, she couldn't help but notice that there was a change in the energy around her. It was subtle, but it was there. People were starting to speak to her as if she mattered, as if her presence had weight, and it made her heart swell with pride. One evening, after finishing a particularly busy shift, Rachel found herself standing near the kitchen, waiting for her next table. She was tired, her feet aching from the long hours, but there was a deep sense of contentment within her. It was a feeling she had never fully known before. This quiet sense of satisfaction that came from knowing she had done her best, from being the person she had always wanted to be. As she stood there, lost in her thoughts, she was surprised when William Ross approached her. His usual demeanor had softened over the weeks, and tonight, he seemed almost vulnerable. "Rachel," he said, his voice low. "I just wanted to thank you for everything." Rachel looked up at him, a little taken aback. William Ross was not a man who typically expressed gratitude, let alone in such an open way. "Thank me for what?" she asked, though she already had an idea. "For showing me something I didn't know I needed to see," he replied, his gaze steady. "You've reminded me that there's more to life than just business deals, money, and power. You've reminded me that being a decent person matters. You've reminded me of what it means to truly see people." Rachel smiled softly, a warmth spreading through her chest. She hadn't expected anything from him, but hearing those words felt like a confirmation of everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for. "You don't need to thank me," she said quietly. "I'm just doing what I can with what I have." William nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I know, but you've changed things here. You've changed me." The sincerity in his voice took her by surprise, and for a brief moment, Rachel felt like she had finally achieved something far beyond her initial expectations. She had made a difference not just in one person's life, but in a way that rippled out to everyone around her. The evening continued on, and as Rachel moved through the restaurant, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from knowing she had done something extraordinary. It was the kind of peace that came from knowing she had done something true. She had stayed authentic to herself, to her values, and that was enough. Rachel had realized something important. Her worth was not determined by the recognition she received, but by the quiet power of remaining true to who she was, no matter the circumstances. And in that quiet power, she had changed more than just her own life. She had changed the lives of those around her, in ways they would never forget. As the weeks passed, Rachel's life at the restaurant continued to evolve. She had found her footing in a way she hadn't known was possible. She was no longer just a woman working a job. She was a woman who had learned to stand in her own power. Her relationship with the other staff members had deepened, and she could tell that they had begun to see her not just as a coworker, but as someone who had brought a shift in the atmosphere, someone who had changed the way they approached their own work. She still did her job with the same efficiency and grace she always had, but now there was a new sense of purpose behind every action. People didn't just look at her anymore, they listened. They respected her, and that respect was something she had earned without asking for it. Her presence had a quiet weight to it that wasn't dependent on the approval of others. That evening, as Rachel moved through the restaurant, serving drinks and clearing plates, she couldn't help but notice a change in the way William Ross interacted with her. He had been a regular fixture in the restaurant, of course, but now his demeanor was different. He greeted her with a smile, spoke to her with a warmth that was reserved for those he truly respected. The distance between them had vanished. It wasn't just his words, it was the way he held himself around her. He had learned to appreciate her not just as a person but for what she stood for. As Rachel made her way past his table to check on another group, he caught her eye. "Rachel," he said, his voice warm and inviting, "can I talk to you for a moment?" Rachel smiled and nodded, making her way to his table. "Of course," she said, placing the water pitcher on the table in front of him. William looked up at her, his expression serious but kind. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said, pausing for a moment as if carefully considering his words. "How do you do it? How do you remain so grounded, so steady, no matter what's going on around you?" Rachel blinked, surprised by the question. She had never expected to be asked something so personal by someone like him. But then she realized it wasn't just a question about how she worked. It was a question about who she was. "I think it's just who I am," she said after a moment, her voice steady and calm. "I've always had to be strong, even when no one saw it. And I've learned that I don't need anyone's permission to be who I am." William nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "I can see that," he said quietly. "I think that's what I've come to respect about you. You don't need anyone to tell you your worth. You just know it." Rachel smiled again, feeling a deep sense of pride settle in her chest. It wasn't about the money or the accolades. It was about the quiet recognition that came from within. That was enough. As she walked away from his table, Rachel realized that she had done what so many people before her had told her was impossible. She had created her own space in a world that tried to ignore her. She had stood firm in who she was, and in doing so she had changed not just her own life, but the lives of those around her. The power she had found was not in the approval of others, but in the quiet strength of knowing her own value. And that was something no one could ever take away from her.